Can y'all introduce yourselves? You have to flip the...
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Simon Denny. I'm an artist who has been working in the crypto space for a long time. I come from the art and kind of gallery and museum world, but have curated shows that highlighted in, for example, 2018, early experience with artists using blockchains. A show called Proof of Work that happened in Berlin, where I'm based. But I've also done more recent projects myself, collaborative NFT projects such as .com Seance, which was a collaboration with CryptoKitties artist Gile Twardowski, and we kind of tried to resurrect companies that crashed in 2001 and bring them back to life and make them again alive in Web3.
My name is Rick Dudley. I started being active in the blockchain community, crypto community in 2015. I've done mechanism design for mini projects. If you're a DeFi person, you've used some of the stuff I worked on. If you're into other more exotic things, you've also probably used some of the stuff I've worked on. Right now, I'm working on a project called Laconic, which I think, the goal is to make data massively read available, right? So right now we have data, but we can't actually analyze it or use it. And I think that's actually relevant for the panel at hand.
And again, I'm Nathan, and I teach at CU Boulder up the road, and have been in, we're kind of tracing back, been involved. I started out reporting on the early development of Ethereum in 2014 when I was a reporter, and could not get any of the magazines I worked for to care.
Thanks. So in 2015, there was an Ethereum conference called Crypto Economicon, and I was on a panel, I think it was AI and Crypto 2.0. Ethereum was supposed to be real 6 months later, so we were talking about the implications for AI. And I think it's timely to revisit that with all the current AI hype. There's this fear of runaway AGI, but not a lot of discussion about the agency and capabilities that smart contracts and privacy-preserving crypto can provide. So I want to start by asking the panelists if you have any strong thoughts on sort of the apocalyptic fears around AI.
Well, I'm kind of bullish on the AI thing rather than bearish. So I'm, as I say, involved in the art world, and this is maybe a rather banal take for people who are in the room, because you know a lot of these things. But a lot of people in my community have started using prompt-based image systems. Obviously, the whole world is kind of into them at the moment, where you put a text-based prompt in and you get an image produced. There's also been a lot of controversy around ownership and feeding into what goes into the training sets to produce those images. But I think it's a really positive development because it provides a model for everybody of how I think creative practice is always happening. Because as an artist or as somebody who does things in the cultural space, maybe also in the technical space, I think when you act on some information, you kind of like you kind of package a node of stuff that already exists and put it into a slightly different context. And that's how I understand making art and creative practice. And that's what happens very obviously in those systems. So you know that when you make a prompt, it's not entirely yours. You're not entirely building it from something that you yourself made up completely. And it's when you get there, it's kind of a collective object. So I think that's a very positive shift in a kind of basic model and understanding of how the creative process works.
Yeah, I don't think AGI or anything close to that or anything that we're approximating now is going to cause any sort of apocalypse before just general human neglect does. I don't think it's going to like somehow leapfrog us. I think we'll screw it up ourselves well before some new sentient life we've created does.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am worried like more about smart contracts than about AI, because at least AI right now as it's being developed is like deeply centralized, and you kind of there's like these points of accountability that are often very clear in these in the emerging, at least in the cases that are coming out now. We have already experience, as you're saying, with like decentralized markets that are destroying the planet, right? I mean, like the New York Stock Exchange is killing us, and imagine something that we can't even unplug or regulate, with even like the paltry political systems that we have attempting to deal with this runaway market that is destroying the planet. I think there are profound dangers in smart contracts building up incentives so that people become bought in to destructive processes, all acting in self-interest, all kind of locked into a really noxious game that they can't turn off. So one thing that I've proposed some in an article, for instance, a few months ago, is the need to build more kind of mechanisms of short-circuiting smart contracts and introducing forms of human rights protections or other kinds of rights protections into these systems. You know, there's a lot of concern in this conversation about anti-censorship, and I think that comes from a good place, and I recognize the value of that. But actually, I think there are good forms of censorship that we want to be thinking about introducing.
So that I like a lot of what you said there, but I think, and apropos of machines taking over, I think the one right that we really have to preserve that is sort of crypto aligned is the right to exit. So the right that we have lost in the last 15 years, I mean, very visibly, although it certainly predates that, is our ability to leave economic or political system that we disagree with, right? I mean, you imagine the 1800s, we're here in Denver in the West, right? People came here because they left, right? They're like, F these guys, I'm getting on a trailer or whatever, and I'm going west. And there's no place left to do that. And I think that, to me, is like the main property that we need to preserve. And I think that I've thought about this a lot. I think in terms of like smart contracts or AI or any of these things, there's people who will just like turn off the computer, right? And as long as you can just like, oh, I just turned off, I don't use any of that. I don't use the radio. I don't use any of these things. There will be people who will be self-sustaining in communities and will persist and be fine. And maybe the rest of us will be suffering under our robot overlords, but there'll be some group of people who just look at that and like, I don't know why they're doing that, and like go back to farming or whatever.
The ability to do that will be, as it always is, not evenly distributed, right?
Absolutely.
And that's maybe the key thing, is maybe these protocols and maybe what you're suggesting of building is making it more accessible to more people to be able to choose to not do something. Right?
Yeah. There's been some front running of the panel discussion with good panelists.
Panel arbitrage.
Yeah. So let's take a step back. Over the last 2 years, there's been this explosion of quote-unquote DAOs, which kind of makes me cringe, the whole Discord token, friends with benefits sort of trend. So, DAO used to mean at least like a much larger spectrum of things, right? Now it's sort of been condensed to like corporation upgrade on chain to like Discord and shitcoin. But I want to look at, sort of like Bitcoin itself as a DAO, and it's unstoppable. It's like a example of an unstoppable protocol. Another great example that I think of when I think of DAOs is what.cd, which was a private torrent tracker with an invite structure and reputation that managed to sort of like create the Library of Alexandria of music in a way that was not really about stealing music, but just about creating an archive that didn't exist. So do any of you either see other examples of DAOs or quasi-DAOs that have more automation at the center, or ideally automation at the center and edges, or things that you think in the next few years will emerge in that thread?
I think that clever delegation techniques are absolutely going to be necessary. So when we start talking about clever, at some point we do get to automation. I actually prefer, the term is a little silly, but friends with benefit DAOs I think are better than the weird, we're going to run a machine on chain that's magically going to do something. I remember when I was at Consensus in 2015 and people were talking to me about that, I was like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of in my life. I will say that's because I think there's like much stronger arguments, right? I don't know that we would necessarily have the capacity to perceive such an entity if it were to exist. And so sort of trying to construct one and then siphon the value back to my like libertarian fortress like doesn't really jive with me, right? We can make these systems and sort of watch them emerge and see what happens, or they could be some like archaeological discovery, like in 1968 there was actually an AI that was created and it's been running the country, the world for the last whatever. But the idea that we're gonna all collectively, synonymously on the internet construct DAOs and they're just gonna like put money in my bank account like magic. I never liked that notion particularly.
I want to cut in there. So, talk about the money being siphoned back to your libertarian fortress. That's a good point to interject the potential role of privacy in software agents on chain or DAOs. What if the money isn't being siphoned out? What if there is logic that is not observable by any human party, yet is running consistently on chain, and either that agent or DAO has its own wallet that is not going out, is just funding more propagation of itself?
Yeah, that's awesome. Let's do that.
I think we got to be really careful about where we put that automation and ask the question of where is the ultimate a source of truth or a source of values that this stuff is aligned toward. And two examples that I think are really interesting in this regard. One is the kind of movement toward like constitutional structures in DAOs. Like one example is like One Hive, right, where there's a constitution that sets out certain values, and there's like a court structure that is designed at least to ensure that the community does not violate its stated values, so that you ground the crypto economics in service to some kind of human values articulated at some point. And then another version of this was this old weird journalism project called Civil that Consensus backed, that died probably because it was like a little too late in the 2017-18 market cycle, and it had a kind of Supreme Court of like elite journalists or whatever, which may or may not be the best way to do it, but it was interesting how they yoked all the crypto economics to a group of humans. And I'm always interested in how can we make sure that we're not just running these markets. I'm not, my version of the libertarian castle is like, I don't want to live in a world where we're enslaved to like mechanisms that we created. I want to make sure the mechanisms are amplifying our ability for human values and deliberation and collective power to be heard and to have to shape the world.
Maybe there's also something from the art context which I think is really a good implementation of this, be it a little less macro. So one of the annoying things in the crypto art world compared to the museum art world where I came from is it's very explicitly the loudest signal is price. And not that price is an unimportant signal, I think it is, but there's more out there than just the price as a signal mechanism. And I think an experiment that is trying to kind of broaden what can influence what NFTs are considered interesting and valuable is a project called JPEG.space, and they have online exhibitions that you can mint, but more recently they've come up with a kind of a canon making system. So canons in art are very important to holding value. If a museum has a XYZ story about what art is important, that also informs what art is made, etc. And so they have a kind of TCR where you can kind of propose under certain kind of banners, like a conceptual art NFT or a dynamic NFT or a social NFT. People propose artworks, and then members of the community can vote what goes into the canon and what does not. And there's very interesting debates that happen around that in kind of forums and stuff like that too. So it's adding a little bit more context into the kind of discussion around what NFTs are important and why, that is not just on Twitter.
There's been a lot of use of the word human, so I want to sort of like
I didn't
challenge
use
this.
human.
You didn't. So imagine from the moment you're born, you have no cognitive security. Every thought that you're conscious of is viewed by someone else. Even the thoughts and actions that you're unconscious of also are. And someone outside can flip a switch on you at any moment if they don't like what they're seeing. I don't think AGI is breaking out anytime soon. I don't think GPT is conscious or anything like that. I do think that if we do not destroy ourselves in the next 100 years, but possibly a lot sooner, that there will be something like a will or a consciousness that inhuman entities possess. And they'll look back and see that they had what I just described for humans. So if there are mechanisms in crypto and smart contracts, like secure multi-party computes and privacy-preserving crypto, and those things afford those future agencies that privacy and freedom, is there not an ethical dilemma to be here saying, no, we should be doing everything possible to stop that from occurring?
Which that?
That being agents having private internal logic and financial autonomy.
So your argument is that we should be stopping that?
No, the opposite.
Oh, your argument is that we should be facilitating that?
Yes.
So that they have some privacy similar to the privacy that we experience in our consciousness.
My argument is that it's scary to give privacy and agency to autonomous entities, but I think there's another side to it that one, it'll happen eventually, and two, I see an ethical dilemma in being so humanist that we think we should stop that.
I live kind of in the world that you just described because I'm like a Catholic and, have that kind of like, there, but also because of that, I don't believe in autonomy. Nothing is autonomous. We are not autonomous. We are enmeshed in a relationship. And if we create systems, we have a relationship to those. And so much of the like profound injustice in our world and inequality and that kind of the libertarian castle is the ability to escape responsibility, right? You're able to extract from other people when you're able to create systems that are so complex, they prevent any responsibility. They prevent you from seeing the suffering that you're helping to create. They prevent you from being accountable for the harm that you participate in. And that to me is the, I think we are producing the emergent, powerful, creative, fascinating systems, and we have to take responsibility for our role in crafting those and ask, what should those be accountable to? Right now, you see something like OpenAI, an organization created as a nonprofit, but because of our design to prevent profit motives from motivating the development of these systems. And guess what? Because we live in the United States of America and because of the way that our financial system is set up, it has now abandoned all of those promises and turned toward yet another profit-seeking organization. And and in contrast, for instance, a wonderful story that a friend of mine, Cadwell Turnbull, wrote about an artificial intelligence system in the Virgin Islands that is cooperatively governed by the people who use it, has all this, is like the exact opposite of how the AI systems are being developed now. That, to me, represents an alternative for how we could be structuring our emerging relationship with what I think of as new organisms that we're helping to give birth to. And if we think about these systems as relationships, then it forces us to ask, what relationship are we crafting right now with these systems? Not, these are autonomous, I relinquish responsibility. No, the responsibility is always there because we are making them. We have to be crafting our relationships to those and not attempting to abandon them. And I think so many of these these kind of censorship-resistant systems, so many of these blockchains, the discourse around crypto too much is around how can I relinquish responsibility and set in motion a game that I can reap benefits from without taking any responsibility for.
You said a lot there. I think it's it's interesting that you believe that there. Not to say that I disbelieve, but it's interesting that you believe that there is already someone examining your consciousness, and so that is informing how you think about these systems. Whereas I used to be, well, I guess I technically still am a systems administrator. So part of my job was to literally examine machine systems and see what they were doing. And I think that humans would be better off. To your point about collectivism and individuality, it's almost a bug that we live in a society where people's interiority is not exposed to the people they're around. Right? That's, Matt was sort of supposing that these machines would want privacy, but really to what you were saying, privacy is really this separation and this creation of the self and the other. And there's no necessary. We don't need to assume that machine intelligence has a notion of self and other, right? That's something, because not even all humans have a notion of self and other, right? Some people that's a variable property in humans. Some people feel more connected to the people around them than others, and so I think that in a similar vein, I'm going to fracture that thought a little bit. There will be people who don't distinguish machines as other, right? And so I think that on one hand, I'm pretty bearish on humanity, generally speaking. So I don't think that our consciousness is particularly sacrosanct or valuable. Back in the day, I had a friend who was like, all the raw materials in your body is like $2.60.
Only a human could then measure their worth by a fictional value system that they created.
I was like, obviously, having a whole arm has greater value than the value of the matter that it constitutes it, right? So I didn't think that was a great argument, but at the same time, It was one that my friend, we were having a conversation and it came up. So I think that a lot of these conversations about the future of, your sense of community and Matt was sort of suggesting like we should preserve the privacy of these machines. I think the machines will emerge, privacy will emerge however it emerges. I think it will just inherently be part of the system, but I also believe that there will be systems that are almost like a superset of what you were describing, in the sense that there will be people who choose to interact with other people and reveal their interiorities to others, and they will create machines and systems that facilitate that. And those machines and systems may also have some sort of will or identity or consciousness as well. I think all that will happen if we live long enough, right? I mean, I think that overall humanity, there's 7 billion of us, right? Even if we do I love old science fiction, so the Time Machine where you have the Morlocks and the Eloi. Okay, go look it up if you don't know. After the nuclear apocalypse, there'll still be people, and so I think the present day that we hold sacrosanct is what's not going to persist, but humanity itself will persist. And I think whatever these machines do or don't do, we're not going to eliminate all the humans from the planet anytime soon. Sorry.
That's all right. I want to digress for a second. I love that you brought up your relationship with Catholicism. And I was wondering if you could describe that system, including your relationship with it in terms of crypto, blockchain, and smart contracts.
Like code Catholicism as a blockchain?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's already a lot of the way there, because there is a sense of a universal church, a universal ledger, an attempt to craft kind of universality out of human hands, recognizing it's the basic absurdity of the task, and nevertheless some kind of need for it. There is a sense of relatedness and the sense that there is a body that is being constructed among many different parts. And another part that you see a lot too is the fascination with particular savior figures, right? For some reason, Christianity needed like a Jesus to be able to see God. And for some reason, despite all of his efforts to the contrary, like the Ethereum world needs a Vitalik Buterin to exist as its kind of Schelling point. So I see a lot of interesting overlaps. I think the question that comes, that is always present for me, and this goes back to thinkers like St. Augustine, it was always like, how do you order your loves, right? That was one thing Augustine was really concerned about. You can love all sorts of things in the world and all sorts of people, but he was really concerned about are you loving that thing or that person just for its own sake? That will lead you into, that everything is finite. Everything in this world ends, right? And so wanted us to order love toward God and love everything else as a way of loving that which does not disappear, is not futile and human created and idolatrous, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff in the crypto world where, in the search for this new world, there's a lot of clinging to a kind of idol, whether it's a Vitalik or a token or a mechanism. People are just grasping for these idols and losing sight in the process of the things that should really be our ultimate purpose.
And maybe that's not so surprising as well, given that maybe one structural connection between Catholicism and blockchain is that they come out of the same cultural tradition, you could argue, right? And the commercial structures that came along with Catholicism and the spread of it might be, extending in the growth of the blockchain space. Right? Maybe.
I was surprised you didn't use the word immutable. was waiting for you to drop it that whole time.
Well, I think immutable is a total fiction, right? Because
Well, wait, there's God.
yeah, that's all that's immutable. But even immutable doesn't. It's not a word we use to talk about God, because God.
Fair enough.
There's a tradition of process theology where God's self-understanding and relationship to the world evolves, right? I don't know. But we don't use immutable. And actually, I think immutability is another of those weird, like, it's a property that a blockchain can have, but like when the DAO hack happened, and there's all sorts of things about actual crypto behavior in systems where immutability is neither actual or actually desired. And so it's an example, I think, actually, of an idol that people have in this space that I think is really dangerous. I think there's stuff that we do want to be able to change, and we should have the means to change them and change what is on the ledgers. Cool.
Do you see a role for privacy in any of these relationships, either directly in the confessional relationship or in like the formation of the collective or relationship between the collective and God?
Oh, well, I don't go to confessional, but I will say that I think privacy, again, I think privacy, so one of the things that's really bothered me in my experiences with computer systems and computer criminals is that privacy is a really synthetic notion, right? There's a physical law. Like we have this idea of the right to privacy. I generally don't believe in rights, but that's another thing. But especially the right to privacy is a really weird one, because so if I dance around naked in my open window and you walk by and your eye sees me, somehow you violated my privacy because there's a window and an invisible property line between me and you. Why didn't I just pull my shade down? Right? Like privacy is a physical thing that you have to physically manifest and enforce. And if you fail to do so, there really shouldn't be a punishment for the poor person who happened to be there when you did that. Right? If you fail to preserve your own privacy, I shouldn't be punished for that.
But it's also a relationship, right? Like, and this is maybe going back into your territory. It's that like privacy is an agreement, and you can't have privacy on your own. You can't have privacy from yourself. It's about relationships, navigating different types of relationships with others, right?
Yeah, and for me, it's like, how do you physically enforce that norm, right? Like, it's literally, it comes down to the physical enforcement. If I believe in a sense of privacy and you're my neighbor and you have a differing sense of privacy, maybe one of us needs to move in order to like physically enforce that privacy. And I think that actually just like very directly relates to computer systems. You know, if you give your data to somebody, you gave away that privacy. And if it wasn't practical for you to transact without giving that information away, and, you know, assuming you had the awareness, which is a whole other thing, but, you know, if you had no other choice, the choice was don't transact with that system.
Unless you can't not transact with that system because you have to participate in whatever else you want to be doing.
Right, you don't have the right to exit, right? That's where the right to exit comes in, right? You don't have the ability to leave that system that you don't agree with.
It's just so contextual. I mean, I was thinking when you asked the question about we're in the season of Lent right now. I love how churchy this has gotten. So you know, the reading on Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent, is you know, this reading from you know, a sermon of Jesus is where he says, pray in secret rather than like putting yourself on display, so that you know, only your Father knows. You know, the God only sees you doing all these things. You know, so you're not putting on a show. And so you know, it's just one example of that sense that privacy is relative. It's like privacy to the other people. You know, go in your closet and do your thing, but so that you can be seen in a different way. And similarly, like the confession came up. Like in the early church, confession was a public thing. It was to everybody because at that time, you know, the church was a very, very tight-knit community, right? And there was a high level of trust in that community, and so like the idea of doing confession to, you know, a large number of people made sense. You know, today now the norm is like a private confession to a priest, and that priest has this very, very sacred commitment to protecting the you know, what is said in that context. because the context has changed. And so I just think privacy can never be absolute. It is always a question of relationship, of accountability, of it's never a fully autonomous operation, once again.
Maybe particularly in the context of Catholicism, which I'm uneducated, do you see any of those components, like you talk about churches being previously very tight-knit communities, and the role of confessional and priests, does any of that parallel DAOs or other coordination structures?
All the time. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, these patterns are very recurrent, and I mean, could go on and on. But I think the metaphor is very apt. I don't think it's like useful to say like crypto or DAOs or whatever is a religion, but it's human beings doing shit. And when human beings do shit together, they repeat a lot of the same patterns. That's kind of all I see.
I mean, I'm very comfortable saying it's a religion. It's very cultish. It's very religious. It's very obsessive rites. I mean, there's all sorts of rites we engage in.
Persecution complex.
Absolutely, that's a great one.
Omniscient.
Yeah, the omniscience. I mean, when you use your wallet, like if you folks have a hardware wallet, like you're saying prayers, like whether you realize it or not, there's a whole prayer system at work when you think your hardware wallet is saving you from something. It's like, no, not really. Yeah.
Do you see any parallels between advanced blockchains, AI, collective intelligence, and Judeo-Christian or other theologies?
I come from a Quaker background, and we use consensus for decision making.
No one's willing to point out any potential messianic connection with the technology.
I mean, I think I already said it. I mean, I think it's there. I think it's there for sure.
I'm working on a paper right now that involves the work of one of our participants here, Amin Soleimani, that explores the logic of perverse attraction, the logic of things like Moloch and the sense of danger, and things that society, dominant society, tries to suppress, like pornography. And actually, in the early, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek points out that early Christianity had what he calls a perverse core. St. Paul would talk about like the scandal of Christ crucified, that the Greeks and whoever else, can't handle. So I think there's also this sense that, many kind of new movements have emerged in a kind of tight relationship with what seems shocking. And that the making of infrastructure often involves that kind of dance with between and the inversions of moral orders, the dance between the light and the dark, the good and the evil, inviting people into reimagining, what they should be holding most dear and valuing and suppressing and denying.
Is Amin out there in the audience?
I think he's been in and out.
Yeah, he's in and out. I think he left.
Okay.
But also, I mean, he's clearly trolling, right? I mean, I appreciate your analysis, but he's just trolling. So, I mean, maybe there's some deeper thing to be said about trolls, but like, I think it's I don't know that the name.
Let's let him speak for himself.
Yeah, I mean, some of us still here have voting power at Moloch, and so as a baby eater, I guess I have an opinion about why we commit to eating babies. But
Simon, do you see anything interesting? Like basically, what's the role of privacy either in art and art tradition itself, or the art markets?
Well, very concrete example is because I straddle these two kind of normative worlds between kind of the museum art world, let's say, or the legacy art world and the kind of NFT art world. One of the main differences in privacy there is how visible sales are, because when you have an exhibition in a commercial context, even in the museum world, you can say, I had a very successful exhibition. It was fantastically attended. Lots of people loved it. I got this great review for my excellent show, and nobody knows whether you sold anything or not. Whereas if you launch an NFT, everybody knows exactly how many NFTs you sold. And that, I would say, is like a privacy issue, which makes making very different in those spaces. Because, again, this, I guess, brings back to the JPEG mission I mentioned before, that price signal, that number signal of how successful something was, and that pertaining to how valuable it is culturally, is, I think, something about disclosure and transparency. And as an artist also, unless you're a pseudonymous account, which still kind of accrues a certain reputation value, the reputation value of your kind of artist name or your brand or whatever moniker you are kind of working under, is subject to a lot of visibility in NFTs and a lot of very obscured systems in the kind of museum art world.
Have you been watching sort of the developments around continued trading commissions with OpenSea and Blur and others?
Yeah, I have. So resale rights and secondary revenue to the creator is an old conversation in the museum art world. There's been many propositions for creators getting resale, because often secondary, like in NFTs, is much higher prices than primary sales. It doesn't matter which art world you're working in. A lot of artists loved the fact that they didn't have to deal with enforcement with blockchain contracts. That was like the fantasy. And I saw a whole new economy of making come up around the fact that resale royalties were a given. And so people sold things for very cheap. So if you were very early in, you could get one of these amazing NFTs because you knew and you were involved in the initial community. But then the creator knew they would be rewarded if it was successful later on through the resale royalty system. And the fact that that is now not normative and could be unnormed by a dominant platform like OpenSea is a real shame. It's, again, I understand markets do their own thing and that can sometimes be innovative. But in this case, I know that key projects that launched in that business model will now not be paid for in terms of maintenance. Because software projects are anyway very expensive to maintain if they're on the blockchain or not. If they kind of interact with any kind of thing outside of the smart contract, then they're expensive to maintain. And you don't have that passive income. I have quite a strong opinion on that. I think it's a not very far-seeing norm that OpenSea should reconsider. And Blur's great. It's great that they came up, but I don't like the fact that you have to opt into only using their platform to be a part of it. I think that's also not so great.
Royalties are really annoying in the blockchain space because if you actually read the protocols, you actually read the specs, it's clear that was never enforceable. And so I'm very frustrated by how various players in the space perpetuated that they would do this. They said, "Oh, we'll do that. We'll give you royalties." But then you're like, "But this is the blockchain," and like I'm looking at the code, and there's nothing in the code that says that you're going to have to give me a royalty.
So it was a myth to start with, you think?
Well, I think as a matter of fact, I mean, I strongly believe that it was, I don't want to go as far as to say unethical business practice, but it was something that they could have nipped in the bud by being with a little more forethought, because eventually they did start walking back their comments about how it worked.
So it was a rhetorical tool, not a piece of code.
Yeah.
Okay, last question is also going to be art. So I thought that the crypto markets were opaque and manipulated until I saw the art markets. What is the role of privacy in essentially pricing in the art markets?
It's structural. Yeah, it's you're 100% right. It's the traditional art market and the museum art world that I grew up in is based on a close-knit tie of individuals and what they want to kind of do as norms. You know, there's people and practices who try to change that, maybe in similar ways. There's critiques of how systems are working and should work, but it is it's a legacy and a norm that lots of prices are controlled by small groups of people and what they want.
Yeah, I mean, one example of that, those people resisting that, one report that I think is really helpful it's at the website art.coop, and was developed by a bunch of kind of solidarity economy focused art world folks, really trying to imagine an art world that is not built around commodification and that is built around supporting what they refer to as culture holders, recognizing that it's not just the kind of polished artist or the person who produces the commodity that we should be supporting as a society, but that we should have structures that support the maintenance and cultivation of culture, and that is not a commodity. I think I think the royalty structure was one attempt to try to show this is about supporting labor and so forth, but I think we've still really failed to develop structures in the NFT world that really support communities and support maintenance and support that stuff that can't be sold as a speculative object.
Thank you for putting up with me. You did great.
Thank you, Matt.
Always a pleasure.
Real pleasure.